This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 641 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I've done a lot of episodes of this podcast. Through the years, I've done studies on running back handcuffs, on quarterback rushing, on breakout wide receivers. There's been a wide variety of topics covered. Plenty of those topics quickly come and go. You listen, you take it in, and you move on. But others over the years have really stuck. And one of the things that has stuck most since I started doing this podcast is the concept of ambiguous backfields. Years and years ago, I did a study on how to spot breakout running backs in fantasy football. I revisit the study every year, but the gist of it is that I looked at non-early round running backs and found which running backs outperformed their average draft position most. From there, I found traits that these players seemed to share. One of those traits was that they came from, as I dubbed it, ambiguous backfields. That these breakout running backs weren't emerging from backfields with any sort of established starter. Initially, that's all the ambiguous backfield idea meant. That the running backs that we should be drafting are coming from teams where there's no established starter. Where the first running back drafted from that team is going in round 5, or round 6, or round 7, or round 8. Then last year happened, and that's where this story gets a lot more complicated. Now, before moving on, I want to remind you that there's no better time than today to sign up for FanDuel Fantasy. For users who have yet to make a deposit on FanDuel Fantasy, you can deposit today to receive 2 free entries. All you have to do is deposit a minimum of $10 into your FanDuel DFS account, and you'll be instantly rewarded with 2 free vouchers. It's a limited time offer, so be sure to deposit now and play for free. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. So every year when I revisit the breakout studies, I try to find some other things that I may have missed when previously looking over all the data. Last year, I noticed that not only were ambiguous backfields the right kind of backfields to target in the middle and later rounds, but I also saw that team RB1s had stronger hit rates than team RB2s. And let me be clear here. When I say team RB1s, I'm referring to whichever running back gets selected first in fantasy drafts from his team, whichever one has the highest ADP. So I'm talking about, let's say, Ezekiel Elliott versus Tony Pollard. Ezekiel Elliott is his team's RB1. When analyzing the middle rounds in particular, if you were drafting a team's RB1, that player had a much higher hit rate than a team RB2. And that makes some sense intuitively, right? We've elevated high-end handcuffs for years in fantasy football. Even before we had this current situation where players like Tony Pollard and A.J. Dillon had some standalone value. I'm talking like the Ben Tates of the world. The market would draft these high-end handcuffs relatively early, or with a single-digit round pick. But those players needed that injury to happen to their starter to really have league-winning value. And those injuries don't happen all that often. Not only that, but when they do, the backup running back isn't always who he thought he was. He either isn't very effective, or he himself splits the backfield with another player. Regardless, the data told me last year that team RB1s are better than team RB2s in the middle rounds. Now, historically, I've done this breakout running back study by looking at season-long numbers, but I want to switch it up and look at points per game numbers. It basically shows the same thing, but I think there's a little bit more accuracy with points per game. If you look at my fantasy league redraft ADP from 2011 through last year and analyze running backs who, number 1, played at least 8 games in the season, and number 2, were drafted between rounds 6 through 9, so pick 61 through 108, what I'll call the middle rounds, you get the following demographic. You get 128 running backs in total. And of those 128, 75 of them were the first running backs drafted from their NFL team. They were the team RB1s. That means 53 players were not team RB1s. Now pretend you had a scatter plot where on the x-axis, you have average draft position for every running back since 2011. And then on the y-axis, you have points scored, or how many points that player scored in that season. So if you had a running back with an overall ADP of 50, and he ended up scoring 100 points that year, that's a data point. That's a point in the scatter plot. Now do that hundreds of times, and you can create a trend line that shows expectation, or how many points we'd expect a running back to score given a particular average draft position. Like I said, historically, I've done this by looking at overall cumulative season-long numbers. but I switched it up this year to look at points per game among running backs with 8 or more games played. That way things aren't skewed by random injuries that sideline a player for a few weeks. The overall point is still the same, since there's still a strong correlation between overall points and points per game. But this, to me, makes things a little bit more precise. So like I said, we have 75 team RB1s and 53 team RB2s that have been drafted in rounds 6 through 9 since 2011. And they've played at least 8 games. And this is redraft data, not best ball data. Of those 75 team RB1s, 22 of them were able to exceed ADP expectation by more than 3 PPR points per game. That's a rate of over 29%. Now that 3 number, it's arbitrary, but it's a threshold that's not really easy to hit. And it's a number that I can keep consistent throughout today's episode. So 29% of RB1s drafted in the middle rounds exceeded ADP expectation by 3 or more PPR points. Of the 53 RB2s, that number was 9, which equates to 17%. That's a good bit lower than the team RB1s. Hence, RB1s have been better values in the middle rounds historically than RB2s. That showed up when looking at season-long numbers, and it's showing up with points per game numbers too. And when you bump that up to 5 points per game versus expectation, the RB1s still have an edge over the RB2s by about 5 percentage points. The edge still exists. I took this all a step further last year. Data seemed to show that when there were multiple running backs from the same team getting drafted in these middle rounds, the RB1s on those teams hit at a substantially higher rate. And that's true when looking at point per game numbers as well. So again, we had 128 running backs drafted in the middle round since 2011 who played at least 8 games. 75 of those players were the first running backs selected from their team. 53 of them were RB2s or lower. Of those 75 mid-round RB1s, 12 of them had teammates who were also drafted in the middle rounds with them. Of the 53 team RB2s, 17 had a teammate drafted with them. Now you may be wondering why those numbers are different. And it's because a team RB2 could be drafted after a team RB1, and that team RB1 may not have played at least 8 games. That, and there was one team, the 2019 Eagles, who had 3 running backs getting drafted in the middle rounds. So for instance, last year we had Ronald Jones and Leonard Fournette as an example of this. They were both drafted in rounds 6 through 9. Now of those 12 team RB1s, 5 of them exceeded expectation by 3 or more points per game. That was a rate of almost 42%. Which is bonkers compared to the other hit rates that I'm talking through on today's show. It was the highest hit rate subset in this entire study. Meanwhile, just one of the 17 RB2s hit, meaning less than 6% of team RB2s who were drafted in the middle rounds with their teammate RB1 have exceeded expectation at a high rate. This is what I dubbed the Ambiguous RB1 Theory last season. The Ambiguous RB1 Theory states that when you're looking for ambiguous backfields to target, you should be attacking middle round team RB1s who have teammates who are also being selected in the middle rounds. The logic behind this and why I thought it wasn't totally irrelevant was that number 1, the market just hasn't been that bad at spotting which running back is better in one of these muddy backfields. But number 2, think about why 2 teammates would both be middle round picks. It's likely because either player is good or that both players are in a good situation. Maybe if one emerges, he'd be set. In hindsight, I wish I would have approached all of this in a much different way. Because realistically, there are flaws to this approach. The top flaw being that ADP is going to fluctuate from one source to another, and it's going to even fluctuate during draft season or while you're drafting. For example, last year, Chase Edmonds and James Conner seemed to have this type of pairing and relationship, that they were both middle round picks with how I'm defining middle round. Technically, though, in hindsight, Chase Edmonds' ADP ended up being 57 overall according to the source that I'm using. So James Conner didn't really fall into this category of being a team RB2 drafted with his team RB1 in the middle rounds. Even Leonard Fournette last year. There were a number of people who would message me and say, but Ronald Jones has a higher ADP than Leonard Fournette does. Why isn't he the obvious target? It was poor communication on my end. As an analyst, I have to constantly be looking at what went right and what went wrong, and I have to make sure I'm getting the right information across. So I want to set the record straight with data and how to apply this stuff. The idea shouldn't be so strict. Mathematically, it doesn't make that much sense for that to be the case, since there's a lot of variance with what we're looking at. That variance being that one ADP source is going to be different than another. That makes it really hard to apply to your drafts. So let's look at this at a high level first. Number one, you should prefer team RB1s to team RB2s in the middle rounds overall. And again, this is focusing on normal redraft leagues. There's a difference in how you approach your best ball drafts. And I'm not talking about that here. I'm speaking to managed leagues. So get RB1s over RB2s, generally speaking. But here's where things should change. If you do get an RB2, which is still fine to do, yes, RB1s have better hit rates, but RB2s are still hitting. If you get an RB2, you're better off finding an RB2 that doesn't have an early round running back associated with them. In other words, what we saw with James Conner last year. And data really backs this up. Of our 128 running backs who played 8 or more games and who were drafted in the middle round since 2011, 13 of them had a teammate running back get drafted in the first 2 rounds on average. So 13 middle round running backs had a running back teammate with a top 2 round ADP, meaning all of these 13 running backs were not the RB1s from their team. Of those 13, none of them exceeded ADP expectation by 3 or more points per game, not one. A lot of them were fine. They can still exceed expectation, but none of them were typically league-winning type players when looking across an entire season. That makes a lot of sense and really backs up the work that I've done historically on running back handcuffs. It's not that these handcuffs can't have big weeks when they're called upon. It's that number one, we don't know when they're going to get an opportunity. If a top running back gets hurt, we can't assume that injury is going to happen at the start of the season. So in turn, a handcuff's point per game rate looks pretty bad. That doesn't excuse things though. Not only could an injury just never happen to a top running back, but handcuffs in most leagues, especially non-deep leagues, those handcuffs are the first to go on your roster when you start picking up players off the waiver wire. The easy examples historically include Ben Tate and Tevin Coleman. Coleman's an interesting case because he'd exceed expectation by a little bit, but never by enough to be super valuable on a points per game basis because Devontae Freeman in that backfield was in the way. These types of players can be values, but they're rarely league-winning players across an entire season, which makes a good bit of sense since they're sharing a backfield with a really good running back. Now, once you hit round 3 for a running back teammate and maybe mid-round 3, I would argue the ambiguity at least starts to begin. I've gotten this question a lot, actually. What defines an ambiguous backfield? Since I've focused so much on players after round 5, I've generally defined it as that, as running backs who are part of backfields where the RB1 isn't drafted before round 5. But I haven't put that much thought into it because I never thought that it mattered that much. But I think it does when communicating this idea, so I looked at the data. Truthfully, we should feel a lot more comfortable with RB2s when their RB1 teammates are drafted in round 3 or beyond. We've had some big hits from middle round running backs who had running back teammates drafted in rounds 3 through 5. And interestingly enough, that's largely the running back dead zone, or a big chunk of the dead zone. Since 2011, we've had 23 running backs picked in rounds 6 through 9, with their running back teammate going in rounds 3 through 5. In other words, they're middle round running backs, team RB2s, but their running back teammates are basically dead zone running backs. You ready for this? Almost 35% of those players ended up exceeding expectation by 3 or more points. Among all the different running back buckets within this data, that one had the second highest hit rate. The only one that was better were the RB1s with RB2 teammates drafted in the middle rounds with them. The Ambiguous RB1 Theory. Now, your first thought is probably that this has to do with injury, that the guys drafted in the dead zone, they got hurt, and so their backups were able to step in and perform well. But that's only partially true. It's only a little bit true. Running backs miss games. It's just part of the position. But of the team RB2s in this group who exceeded ADP expectation by 3 or more points, their RB1 teammates missed on average just 3 games. I don't think we can solely blame injury for these running backs performing above expectation. I think instead, we recognize why these running backs were drafted where they were drafted in the first place. This is another knock on running backs who get drafted in the running back dead zone. My reasoning as to why the running back dead zone exists in the first place, which by the way, I did a rewind episode on the dead zone just a couple of weeks ago in the podcast feed, so listening to that will allow this to make a lot more sense. But my reasoning as to why the running back dead zone exists is because of a supply shortage combined with teams wanting to fill their rosters. Most fantasy managers want multiple running backs early on in their draft. But true projectable bell cow running backs don't really exist past like RB15 or RB16 each season. Instead of recognizing that fact and going with a wide receiver, managers force the issue and they reach consistently. That creates ADP where these running backs are being overdrafted. They're inferior players going too high in drafts. And what does that allow for? It allows for competition. It allows for another running back in that backfield to step in and do something. Because the RB1s aren't very good. Or at least they're not round 3, round 4, round 5 good. We know that these dead zone running backs don't give us league winners at a much better rate than running backs that you get a couple of rounds later. And it's probably because they're not as good. So if they're not as good, their teammates are able to make noise and be relevant in fantasy football. Not only that, but we're talking about middle round team RB2s in this scenario. If a player is the second running back on his own team, but he still has that type of ADP, then that player is probably pretty good himself. For example, in 2018, Tariq Cohen was drafted in the 8th round. Jordan Howard, his teammate, was getting picked up in the middle of the 3rd round. Cohen was coming off a rookie season where he was electric with the ball in his hands. He caught 53 passes. Jordan Howard was this typical dead zone-esque running back to avoid, given he had 2 seasons under his belt and he hadn't hit 30 receptions in either season. Tariq Cohen was talented and he clearly had a role. Jordan Howard was clearly being forced up draft boards because the position dried up and there's a natural demand for running backs. If you have a middle round running back who isn't sharing a backfield with an obvious stud, like this scenario, it could signal that number 1, the market thinks that running back is good since he's got a decent enough ADP. And then number 2, if he's good and if the player ahead of him is a little bit overrated, then there's a higher chance that RB2 can carve out a role. We have to remember that I'm defining the worth of these players by comparing their output to their expected output. The later in the draft you get, the lower the expectation. So if you're raising inferior players up draft boards into that dead zone area, they're going to have a tougher time exceeding expectation. Meanwhile, their teammates are going to be able to do well themselves. So your question then might be, well then why are team RB1s who get drafted with their running back teammates in the middle rounds so much better? Why wouldn't we see that even out a little bit more like we do with these dead zone running backs? And I think the answer to that is because we're not terrible at picking out who the RB1 is in a given backfield. When you look at the dead zone analysis, the dead zone running backs may be playing lower than expectation, but they're still generally getting to 10, 11, 12, 13 PPR points per game. It's just that where they get drafted, they're expected to score a lot more than that. With 2 middle round picks, with 2 middle round running backs, expectations are generally the same. So the guy who people think is going to emerge is probably going to have an easier time exceeding expectation. Let me also be clear that the middle round running back data is small. There's variance to all of this. But I do think it makes more sense to get these RB2s who share backfields with a dead zone running back, since something is probably going right talent-wise for that RB2 to still have some sort of higher ADP, despite having a teammate getting drafted so high. Now, I know I focused on the middle round running backs primarily so far, but it's because those are higher leverage picks. Later round running backs, they're mostly dart throws. With later round running back picks, though, a lot of the same ideas hold true. Since 2011, we've had 278 running backs get drafted between round 10 and round 16, or pick 109 to 192. That's at least according to my data. Most drafts are about 16 rounds, which is why I stopped there. Of those 278, only 15 of them were their team's RB1, which is crazy to think about that you could get a team RB1 that late, but it's happened before. Of those 15 players, 4 of them ended up exceeding expectation by 3 or more PPR points per game. That's a rate of almost 27%, which is slightly less than the RB1 rate that we saw from middle round running backs. The remaining 263 running backs drafted in the later rounds were non-RB1s. That's not surprising. And of those players, fewer than 23% ended up exceeding ADP expectation by 3 or more points. So once again, RB1s have been better than RB2s, but by a lesser amount compared to the middle round selections. Looking more at these non-RB1s who were drafted late, 81 of them had an RB1 teammate drafted in rounds 1 and 2. 92 of them had an RB1 teammate drafted in rounds 3 to 5. And 90 of them had one drafted in the middle rounds, around 6 through 9. The hit rate for these 3 buckets were as follows: 16%, 21%, 23%. To put this another way, as the backfield became more ambiguous, running backs in the later rounds exceeded expectation at a more significant rate. So what does this all mean? How do we put a bow on all this? Well, let's look at what I said at the start. Team RB1s are better bets than team RB2s. Across the board, that's the case. Whether you're looking at the middle rounds or the late rounds. And it seems like they've really hit when they've got teammate RB2s in the middle rounds with them. Though there is some variance there. If you're getting a team RB2 though, I'd focus on RB2s who are obviously talented, who could have a role in their offense. And I wouldn't shy away from RB2s who have RB1 teammates getting drafted in the dead zone. And generally speaking, team RB2s who have teammates getting drafted in rounds 1 or 2, they're not hitting at a super great rate. Again, ADP is going to shift, and this type of analysis, which is ADP focused, isn't going to work for all league types and structures. But it's definitely good to know. It's good to think about, because I do think utilizing this information can help you increase your probability of winning at the running back position in your league. Target those ambiguous backfields. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Again, remember to check out lateround.com for the guides that I'm producing, the Patreon link, the newsletter. There's a lot there. Check it out, lateround.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening. I'll catch you later in the week.